start. Very good. Lovely. Well, a very warm welcome to what promises to be a wonderful event. You already know something I suspect most of you about both the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, and the Insiders Outsiders Project, and I welcome you on behalf of both organizations very warmly. As you may know, the Insiders Outsiders Project, which I am the director of, started off with the primary intention of paying tribute to that remarkable generation of refugees, mostly Jewish, not always, but mostly Jewish refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe, who so hugely enriched this country's culture. And it seems to me a kind of very logical kind of offshoot and kind of, if you like, sequel, an aspect of its afterlife, that we should increasingly be paying attention to those members of the so-called second generation, like Judy, like myself, who are responding in creative and interesting ways to their parents' experience. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Judith Tucker, who is a very fine artist in her own right, who will be, I think, most appropriately for our remit, talking both about her wonderful mother, Eva Tucker, the writer, and about her own work as a visual artist made in response to her mother's and the family experience. So let me start, if I may, just by saying a few words about Judy herself. She completed a BA in Fine Art from the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford, and then that was followed by an MA in Fine Art and a PhD in Fine Art at Leeds University, and she's held an AHRC, an academic fellowship in the creative and performing arts at the University of Leeds between 2003 and 2006. And in 2013, she was invited to be one of the artists in the Contemporary British Painting organisation, which was a platform for contemporary painting in the UK. She's currently vice chair of that organisation. She co-convenes a really interesting kind of cultural network called Land 2, which you can check out for yourselves, and also one called Mapping Spectral Traces. So she's a rare and I think really successful example of somebody who both combines academic writing and very sort of rich creative practical practice as well. So she's written many essays which have been published both in journals and in books. She's exhibited as an artist, she's exhibited widely, not only in London and other parts of the UK, but also, let me just run through it, Romania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Austria and the USA, even in China. When she's not in her studio, this is her own words, she's senior lecturer in the School of Design at the University of Leeds, and she'd like me to add that she has a long-time collaboration with the poet Harriet Tarlow, who's in the audience today. And if you're interested in finding out even more about her, and I'm sure you will be, by the end of this event, she has, of course, her own website, www.judithtuckerartist.com. Lovely, thank you, and over to you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Monica, for such a warm welcome.
When her grandfather's iron cross, of which he was so proud, ceased to be a protection against the jackboots and the Jew-baiting, Anna's father made arrangements for her mother and herself to go and stay with Quaker friends of his in England, 3 old ladies who lived in the country. The talk above Anna's head was all of concentration camps, emigration, invasion, and, with mounting heat, the requisitioning of non-Aryan property. Men in green baize aprons came and carried everything away, past other men in khaki shirts and tight high boots, who watched with thick complacency as each piece of furniture lost its identity in transit through the open door. They left a small group of essential items standing compressed at the far end of the room, waiting for removal to premises more in keeping with their racial status. I didn't let them take everything, her grandmother said with a small conspiratorial smile. I locked a few things in the larder. That was a dangerous thing to do, her grandfather answered sternly. Besides, I do not wish to practice deceptions. I have nothing to hide, nothing, remembering the Iron Cross. Everything crumbled. When Anna went to school during the Kristallnacht winter of 1938, there were fewer children and teachers at school every day. We're off to New York next week, Hong Kong, Geneva, Montevideo. And you? And Anna said very quietly, England. She was not good at her English lessons. Yak and Yill go up the hill. She found it difficult to get her tongue round the J's and TH's.
So I wanted to start my talk with the uncanny conversation between myself and my mother at the same age. When she recorded that for BBC Radio 3 in 1989, she was exactly my age. And some of you who know her work will recognise that some of that material made its way into Berlin Mosaic. It's very interesting that she chose to call me Judith with both a J and a TH. So my grandmother never could say my name in that way, and I loved the way she called me Judith. So first of all, I'd also like to thank Monica and the AJR so much for this opportunity to be able to talk about my mother's work in this way. And I'm going to play a few short further excerpts from this recording before I go into some more explanations about her work and her life. You'll notice that not only has some of the material been incorporated into the novel, including the title of this talk and the novel, but importantly, changes to becoming. This is a postcard that you can see that she wrote on the Manhattan, which, as many of you here will know, was very often used by the...
Anna and her mother left Germany from Hamburg that February of 1939 in a long line of Jews, all waiting for the final exit stamp. Anna wondered why people pressed so closely on each other when there was so much unused space around them. A man snatched up her little case and emptied its contents over the trestle table. Crayons, beads, cigarette cards. He didn't know what to do with them. Suddenly, he was a middle-aged man looking at a little girl. "Put them back," he yelled, "and go quickly." Anna was very frightened of him. He had turned so red when he shouted at her. She expected him to hurt her. But nothing more happened. She and her mother were squeezed forward by the next lot of people sweating to be let out. Holding chits of paper with the correct marks on them, they moved through a dark space which suddenly opened into a pool of gold and crimson light. "Follow me," a friendly man in a short white jacket said, taking their cases from them. They were on board the ocean liner, which was taking them across to Southampton. When they got to England, Anna's mother couldn't stop crying in the white house with the brown-tiled roof, deep in the West Country where her father's Quaker ladies lived. But Anna liked them, loved the large garden and the little dog, and above all, loved the flavour of Englishness that came with the smell of lavender and sizzling breakfast sausages. With it came a sense of being allowed to choose things freely, of making your own decisions. Anna couldn't wait to become English. One day, 2 real English girls came to visit, filling Anna with admiration and envy at the easy way they threw off difficult phrases like, "I suppose so," "Don't be pernickety," "It's all higgledy-piggledy." By the summer, Anna's English was fluent. Letters from Germany numbed her mother with homesickness and threw Anna off balance. She was practicing touchdown in the present, and those letters flung her backwards into a time in which she no longer had a foothold. "Don't forget your mother tongue," her grandfather wrote only months before the fatherland consigned him to a death camp. On her birthday, there was a phone call from Berlin. She could hardly bear to talk to all of them, having just blown out the candles on her first English birthday cake. She might have tried harder, had she known it was the lot felt.
So one of the things I'm going to try and show in this talk is that while my mother's main 2 novels were published 40 years apart, the work she did to understand her background was ongoing. Where here, she says to Ruth Gorb in 2009 that the first night when she was having 10 silent nights in a Buddhist monastery, that the first night she had there, she had a vivid dream of her grandmother, and there was a clock that said 5 minutes to midnight. It was telling me to get on with it. It was time I spoke about my background. I think we'll see that there's a little bit of writer's flexibility in the way she's thinking there. There was a lot more to it. And you can see here her publisher and friend, Chip Martin, wrote in her obituary very much this narrative, which has become more popular. Eva's career as a novelist was unusual in that it fell into 2 phases, separated by 40 years. A figure on the literary scene, and we're going to hear more of that. She was published by John Calder and then republished again via Starhaven, Chip's Press. The two books of this phase, Berlin Mosaic and Become English, were in fact memoirs of Eva's early life and of her maternal family, vivid evocations of the German Jewish world lost in a catastrophe that swept young Eva away from her homeland at the age of 9. So here we have these covers of these novels, which I'm slightly responsible for, and Belonging is them joined together. So one thing that I'd also like to add in, that what we cannot fail to note that there is that gap. She never stopped writing. She wrote plays, she translated Joseph Roth, she wrote reviews, she wrote many, many novels which didn't see the light of day. So the two novels published by Starhaven, I'm going to read to you a small section of Becoming English to these images, even though we know it's a fictionalized account. But to her absolute dismay, she's the only one who doesn't go down with German measles. One by one, all the others come out in a rash and are transferred to the sick room in the end house. Every morning, Laura, Anna has changed to Laura by now, examines herself hopefully, but there's no sign of a rash. I suppose Germans don't catch German measles, they say, looking at her suspiciously. It's no good trying to explain that in German measles are not called that. As far as she knows, there's nothing specifically German about the disease. And of course, Germans catch it the same as anyone else. Then why haven't you? They ask. Never in her life has Laura wanted to become ill. Even Miss Elizabeth, when she's giving Laura extra Latin in the library on Saturday morning, looks at her with her head on one side. Lucky girl not to go down with the German measles. When Laura starts to tell her, as she's told everyone, that in German measles are not called that, Miss Elizabeth pats her on the head and starts talking about gerunds. When Laura goes to see Hannah and she welcomes her with the words, "Good, you haven't got German measles, it's going around the whole town," Laura bursts into tears. Over tea and a special treat of chocolate biscuits, she tells Hannah and Klaus what the others have been saying. "Surely you're not going to let such nonsense upset you." They laugh. Klaus pinches her cheek rather like her grandpa used to. She cheers up. That afternoon, instead of doing German, Hannah brings out a Halma board and shows Laura how to play. Concentrating on the game makes her forget everything else. When she gets back to school, 3 of the girls, including Sheila, who have German measles, are up and about again. "Good old Laura," they call out to her. So they think she's all right after all. How quickly the scene can change. "Well, she got into the first hockey 11. Only because I'm so fat I can fill the spaces between the goalposts. The other 10 laugh and pat her on the back. She's not really all that enormous, only not as skinny as most of the others. She just isn't an English shape." They play matches against other schools on the sands. Laura enjoys buckling on the huge pads, enjoys kicking the ball right across the pitch. She's got good at that and hardly uses her stick, so that when the centre forward of the opposing team breaks her stick after a cracking shot which misses the goal, Laura does not think twice about offering her stick to the girl. Afterwards, everyone crowds around Laura. "Jolly decent of you to hand over your stick, and we won all the same." The referee who teaches at the other school comes up to Laura and shakes her hand. Odd to be made a fuss for what felt like nothing at all. It's early on in the book. And I wanted to have a little aside to pay tribute to the original Klaus and Hannah, who were an amazing couple, who actually quite a lot of their life lived in Yorkshire, not very far from here, in Keighley, and he was an anaesthetist. And both of this, if you can imagine how they would be said, I can't read the signs to Keighley without hearing them in Martin's voice. Not only did they take my mother out for every day, they were lifelong friends to her, to the family. They read Rilke together and talked. I remember them coming round to talk about Primo Levi and when Schindler's Ark was published, whether or not it should be read. And so this was some amazing aspects of our lives. Now, when I was researching for this, I was quite surprised. I feel actually as if I've been working on an academic project rather than a family one, because I ended up reading all this, which I'm not going to use because I'm not a literary scholar. I'm going to quote extensively from one person's work, but it's, if you look at most, my mother died in 2015. Most of this work was published after she's died, but I'm immensely proud, and she would have been, that both the experimental novels from the 60s and the two, as Adam Guy calls them, more life-writing novellas of her later years, are being considered in a serious, critical and academic field. I mean, she got both sets of novels were well received in terms of the sort of papers, and it's very good. But this has changed things. So, I'm just going to show you a short excerpt from Phyllis Lasner's Jewish Exile in Englishness, Eva Tucker and Natasha Solomon's. Just to kind of, you can read this, most of it, but it gives you a sense of what Berlin Mosaic is about. And while the two novels are written separately, each with its distinct narrative style and setting, there is a convergence. In Berlin Mosaic, the threatening German Jewish space pretends a grim future, and in Becoming English, the space of rescue cannot escape the past. Now, it's also one thing to have fiction analysed by sharp minds. It's another thing when it's actually fictionalised family memoirs. And it's quite a strange feeling, because both novels and literary criticism are in the public sphere. And these are being analysed by highly astute critics, laying bare of one's mother's and grandmother's very complicated relationship, strangers understanding it, reading it, and interpreting those contradictions and paradoxes that are available through that kind of close reading. And I think here, Susan Weiss really picks up on something. In Becoming English, the protagonist Laura considers her mother Ruth to be the obstacle in her accession to full Englishness. Ostensibly, this arises from Ruth's demeanour and accent. I have to do my grandmother's accent for a moment, and I feel Sophie Herkheim a couple of times ago gave me that permission. We're quite English, aren't we? She says self-subvertingly of their choice of cornflakes for breakfast. Like Simon Silver in Andrew Sanger's The J Word, Laura is, as she puts it, only half Jewish. But in her case, this Jewishness is on her mother's side. So that rejecting Ruth does not just mean rejecting the German past. The adverb only in Laura's phrase sounds regretful, but is actually self-protective. While Laura's hope that here in England she can grow whole implies a Gentile, or at least an un-Jewish completeness. And Lasner, in the last part of this section, its complicated mother-daughter relationship offers a critical perspective on that of Laura and the narrator as arbiters of Ruth's humanity. Because the object of Laura's complaint is also a refugee woman who can find no comfortable space in her rescuer nation, it complicates her daughter's position as the novel's focusing subject. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my grandmother as a grandmother. Just to say, this is in 1978, and behind her, you'll see a first-year painting project that I had to do as part of my first term, I think, at Ruskin. And we had to, in the Christmas holidays, we had to go home and paint one of our relatives. And when I was painting her, she was an amazing model. She sat absolutely still. And she suddenly said at the end, it's not the first time I've done this. And I said, right. And she said, well, yes, no, Schlichter painted me. So, and I would really give anything to know where that painting, it was of her and my grandfather, where that was. I expect I have a suspicion though. But she was, for all her faults as a mother, she was a really fun grandmother. And often she is, would you like a whiskey? Don't tell your mother. That was kind of, well, we were quite young when that happened. And I love visiting the block of flats, which were less than a mile from where we lived, next to Chalk Farm Tube Station. the smell of continental cooking coming from under every door, and her friends whose names I've never actually seen written, but who were really fun and a laugh. Mrs. Ziesel, Mrs. Statager, Mrs. Brescher, Mrs. Löwentag. Oh yes, and somebody who was just called the Old One. Now, interesting, it's Margot who brings me to look at my mother's connection with Calder and Boyes. It was one of her Berlin friends who did not make it out, who was the publisher, Marion Boyes' mother, Herta Feiner, who did not make it out. So she, Marion Boyes, brought in one author whom she'd known since her pre-war Berlin days, Eva Tucker, at a time when we were publishing many more young British artists, or authors, not all from British backgrounds. We've published 2 books by Eva Tucker, who has, as a girl, been at the same school in Berlin as Marion Boyes, or Asmus as she was then. Contact was a picture of a marriage and the tensions inside a marriage. Drowning, the second book, explored human relations in a frank way that was only just becoming possible in the 60s, when people were able to talk about their intimate lives and confront homosexuality and other previously taboo subjects without prejudice. Neither novel did as well as they should have, but in those days, publishers could always count on selling at least 1,000 copies. Well, I feel that there's a little bit of a recovery coming now. So here is Herta Feiner with my grandmother on the left, where Margot taught Jim in the Lesserschule, and my mother was also a pupil. And you can, it was very much based on actually the Montessori idea and forest schools. Was actually much more experimental and fun looking than the boarding school that she went to in Weston-super-Mare. They had a lot in common, these 2 women as well. They were both divorcees of non-Jews, but very, very sadly, some of you will probably know, but Herta Feiner committed suicide in a transport to Auschwitz. And in a very fuzzy photograph, you can see my mother at the back at a lesser school Schule reunion in 1994, and her testimony from the Schule in the year 1938-39, which must have been brought to England with her. So here are these more experimental novels that Calder and Boyes published, which were part, she and those novels were part of the experimental prose scene of London, which included Eva Figes and Anne Quinn. And I just want to say now that I'm incredibly grateful to the scholar Adam Guy, firstly, for allowing me to read and use his forthcoming chapter, which is Contacts, Landings, the Holocaust in Late Modernist Form in Eva Figes and Eva Tucker. But secondly, and mainly, for his careful reading of both Eva's works, his reading of both Conic, Landing and Contact, his understanding of the potential of late modernism in a specific place and time, the potential that might have for expressing a traumatic history. He makes astute observations about how both women use life writing 30 years later as a natural fit for what Susan Solomon calls the 1.5 generation, that is child refugees. And I'm going to now quote a very short section of this for 2 reasons. One, I think it's incredibly interesting, and 2, because it also allows me to quote from my mother's novel. Just seeing how I'm doing. So Tucker's narrative begins circling on its occluded centre as Sarah reflects on her newly arrived parents, they're German Jewish, panting to be hurt, asking herself, why wear your cur on your sleeve like a livid Star of David? Why be so crucifixion prone? In the next paragraph, Vera and Arnold's appearance and their request to stay in a house already filled with guests is troped in a resident manner. Arnold turned piteously to his wife. Is she really going to send us to a hotel? I told you. No refuge. Arnold looked at the lovely flower garden with flowers appearing haphazardly in the grass, looked at the stone-grown grey stone house. £10,000. He wasn't going to let Richard marry a penniless refugee. he wasn't going to let any Englishman say far more than Richard's parents could have given him. Inside the house, Arnold bumps into Richard outside the bathroom, deferentially acknowledging him before grimly reflecting that guilt feeling towards the master race was a powerful apparent. These quotations come from one continuous sequence of the novel. They point in turn to Nazi persecution of the Jews in Europe, the Star of David on the sleeve, one of grounds from which this proceeded, the notion of Gentile master race, and an outcome of the latter two factors, forced immigration and the creation of refugees. However, they do not address the Holocaust, which is at this point an unspoken fourth term in the associative chain of references to Sarah's Jewish identity. However, the Holocaust is invoked eventually in a high peak of emotional intensity as Sarah chafes against the presence of her parents in her house. It's quite all right. We won't be in your way. We don't want to embarrass you with your English friends and husband. Sarah was shaking. How can they help it? They feel guilty because they aren't dead. They feel guilty because they weren't tortured. They feel guilty because they're alive, German Jews with English passports, living in affluence when the other 6 million, they feel guilty, guilty, guilty. So do I. Tucker's reference to the Holocaust is clearly more direct than Feige's in Can It Landing, but from this point on in the novel, it's less the facts of the Holocaust, 6 million dead, than its personal and collective after effects, as embodied in the figure of survivor guilt that commands Tucker's attention. I mean, the rest of the article develops in terms of thinking about high modernism through Hannah Arendt, and I cannot recommend it more to people to read when it's published. This, however, it wasn't all. I think what I'm trying to show is that I know that through living with my mother writing, that it was more of an ongoing process than it might appear from an outside. Now, but this, however, is a really much more fun interpretation of it. Think about British fiction in the 60s, and there was a lot of fun as well. It was the swimming 60s, and you can see here, this is very much interpreted in the modernist legacy. And there were parties. There were lots of them with lots of people, and they came to the flat in Belsize Park. There was Yasha Reichardt, who lived up the road. There was Fred and Diana Ullman, there was Bernice Rubens, there was Beryl Bainbridge, there was Michael Hamburger, there was Tony Rudolph, there was Elaine Feinstein, there was Eva Feiges, of course, John and Barbara Latham, and there was often Peter Fryer playing blues on our out-of-tune upright piano just to keep it warm. But it wasn't just an arty crowd. There were philosophers like Ernest Hutton and Imre Lakatos, and scientists like Lewis Wolpert. Now those parties, they've changed a bit, but they didn't stop. The partying in that flat continued, the socializing, the wide range of friends. But the partying continued, and so did the writing. No space to list the many short stories, radio plays, translations, endless reviews here. But it is from her that I learned the value of a daily creative practice. My childhood memories are permeated with the sound of a typewriter. I had to just put in Dorothy Richardson, though. This would not have been a talk about my mother without one mention of her. And in her recent interview, just before she died with Finn in the Dorothy Richardson Studies Journal, she really explains, and it was for me the first time, that it was very much the Jewish issues in pilgrimage that was kept her so passionately involved. But she was an absolute tireless supporter of her. And I put in this copy, a photograph of her copy, which was given to her by my father in 1952. And there's just, to make a sort of segue between a little tour through her writing into thinking about my work, I'm using her article from the 1967 Studio International And you can see, actually, I've left the cover pagings. There's a wonderful set of people, including Escher Reichart there. And I love the design on the front. She was really, really very engaged with visual art. Many artist friends, and I've selected just two that meant a lot to me to talk about after this. And this piece is a very interesting piece, and she asks very pertinent questions in it. How do novelists see painters? Or how do they think painters see painting? So Eva Frankfurt, I've even got here, I don't know if anyone can see this as well, but I'm holding it for good luck. Needs no introduction to many people here. The most wonderful painter who was a very close friend of my mother's. They met when Eva Frankfurter was a student at St Martin's, and my mum used to save her ration eggs to give her so she could use them for painting. And I've got her jug for myself, which is from her studio, and a very small painting, which I absolutely adore, which I live with. And the other painter that was actually the first artist I ever met. Also, because we were born in Wales and moved to London when my mother's novels were published and she was having some success. My father was working in the University of Bangor at the time. And my mother found interesting artists, refugees, wherever she went. And we lived very close to Carol Leck and his father, who were both artists. And I remember being shown how to take a line for a walk. I must have been about 4, take a line for a walk. And then you do some more surrealist techniques there. So those two artists are her friends that I'm showing you. However, her life was filled with them. Now, slightly changing. There are 3 books that I just want to talk about briefly, which all came around the same time. Not the one on the right, but I wanted you all to see this because it's a very important book for those people that are interested in trauma and aesthetics. But first book, many people here will be very familiar with. And I'm sure, as for many of you, when a very perceptive friend gave it to me, it changed the way I thought about my life, my childhood, and what preceded it. And I know that both my sisters who are here today have thought incredibly deeply about these issues. And I'm full of admiration for how they actually work with refugees in their work, where I just make aesthetic objects out of these feelings. My sister Catherine, who works as a priest, has chosen to do so in the highly diverse area of North Croydon. There, she's made links with the local refugee centre and offers pastoral support to asylum seekers and refugees. And it's no accident that my sister Sarah specialised for 15 years, she's a group analyst, and specialised for 15 years in work with refugees and asylum seekers in both the NHS and the voluntary sector. And she continues supervising and working and consulting with the Freedom from Torture organisation. An especially poignant moment for her was when she was invited to Berlin to give the keynote at the Berlin Centre for Intercultural Psychiatry and Psychotherapy. So that book has shaped many of us. Now, I read that book, I carried on with my painting, I was a landscape painter. I also went up to Leeds. I'd been painting and working and teaching, and then I wanted to do further study, and I was lucky enough to do an MA and funding to do a PhD, followed by postdoc. And when I was there was an exhibition on in the Leeds University Gallery by the artist Lydia Baumann, who's the daughter of Zygmunt Baumann. And the catalogue essay for that landscape painting exhibition really changed the direction of my practice for that next period. It was by Griselda Pollock, and it was called Lydia Baumann, the Poetic Image in the Field of the Uncanny. As it's a catalogue essay, I didn't have its book cover, but because I've worked and thought with Griselda, had the privileged to do that for so many years. I really wanted everyone to see this book, which is 2013, After Effects, After Images, Trauma in the Aesthetic Transformation in the Virtual Feminist Museum, as my cover piece for that. And the third very important writer to me, and they're all women, and it is International Women's Day, and I'm talking a lot about my mother and grandmother, so that's actually also very important, is Mariana Hirsch, and it's in the Susan Rubin-Solomon book, and it's Post Memories in Exile. And obviously that's about second generation memory. Now, with those three things in mind, what happened when I read that Lydia Bauman essay was I suddenly realized I'd been thinking about these second generation issues as one thing and my painting as another. And I saw how landscape painting and transgenerational trauma might have some connection. So having that, it was an unconscious thing. I thought about connection, separation. I then got this HRC fellowship, which I did part of this work in. This work I'm showing you is just 3 projects that I did between 2003 and about 2009-10. The first is called Resort. And I think it's very strange. I've never shown my work or talked about my work after I've talked about my mother's work. Actually, I've never talked about my mother's work before in this way. I've only talked about it via my own work. So I'm wondering how it's going to seem. This series, Resort, was visited, after visiting the seaside town of Albeck in North Germany, and the photographs in 1933 are very significant, as shortly afterwards Jews, they wouldn't have been able to visit this resort. And as a landscapist, I wondered what kind of place this was. What was the landscape they were looking at? What would it feel like to be there now? I resolved to visit and work in that tourist landscape. I actually deliberately chose not to work with the more obvious sites. There are different artists with different experiences who've made amazing work about that. For me, a landscape artist very interested in holiday resorts, always have been. This felt absolutely appropriate. But when I got there, what was I going to do? I'd been painting rugged coast of Britain with cliffs and invaginations and amazing shapes. And I wished that my grandparents had had the foresight to go to Rügen on holiday rather than to flat Albeck. But I had this amazing grant for 3 years. I needed to do something. Well, in the end, I actually found a really rich motif in the Strandkorb, the beach chairs, which the hybrids between beach hut and deck chair offer the possibility of momentary shelter. Standing empty on the beach, they have a melancholy charm. Although they do not set out any formal boundaries of their own, in being situated on the beach, they're located on the boundary between land and sea. The structures fluctuate between being a place of protection and almost mawkish in ciphers of vulnerability. Huddled together in groups, they take on an almost anthropomorphic quality, providing me with a resonant motif for my work. They could be thought of as objects of ridicule, a combination of kitsch, camp, and nostalgia, comfortable chairs from which to view the sublime. I'm just going to show you a few of the series, and then I'm going to say, so I also I did an extensive series of these, and I played with all kinds of things, one of which was the position of analyst and analysand. And you can see that people took up different positions in the Strandkorb, and I was interested in that. This one is an analyst. Putting them together, there were contemporary ones put next to drawings made from historic photos. I was also very interested in the idea of the domestic in the wilderness or in the wild, the idea of the sublime, but they were all looking at the sublime, we were looking at them looking at the sublime. And the idea of the domestic, most often that the people in the Strandkorb are doing something, somebody's putting their lipstick on, somebody's having a cup of tea, somebody's putting their hands, and something about the stripes of the that towel on the right really reminded me a little bit of a prayer shawl. And here they are in exhibition. They were large scale. And this was actually in Bath. So the second series, which I think I started around 2005 or 6, were from a inland resort in what was East Germany, and is now, obviously isn't now. And they were pictures of my mother learning to swim. And I was very interested in this idea of, via Marianne Hirsch and many, many other theorists, including Kaya Silman and others, of this idea of paranoid reading and looking back into photographs that look back out at you with the knowledge of something having happened. And the photographs I found most intriguing were the ones of the outdoor swimming pool, and in particular the one of my mother learning to swim wearing a swimming aid, which has the sort of look of a hangman's noose. And I found the peculiar mixture of innocent enjoyment and intimations of death inherent in the belated viewing of these holiday photographs compelling. So here we are at the swimming pool as it is now. Now, when I got there, that is not the same swimming pool. I quickly realized that the swimming pool my mother learned to swim in was long gone. And I realized why she was able to swim in it as a Jew in 1936. How did that happen? Because there was this pool being built, which was actually where the 1906 German Olympic team was going to practice, bringing to mind the diving sequence that concludes Leni Riefenstahl's film Olympia. So this body of work was actually the darkest I made. And there's a lot here thinking about healthy bodies and what was happening to those other bodies in the woods in the Thüringen forest behind where there were camps. When I'd been there a little bit, I'd been sketching, doing some usual thing, the Schwimmbadmeister came up to me and first of all was very suspicious of me because he thought I was photographing his rust and he was going to be in trouble. But when he realized it's just an artist was photographing and drawing for other reasons, he presented me with a fantastic gift, which was a CD, it was in 2005, of a kind of archive of the building of the swimming pool, which then meant that the first project was very much a kind of a family history. This is the opening of the swimming pool. And so through going to this place and using the swimming pool as a kind of site, the idea it moved beyond the family to the social space. And marvelous things happened through this archive, which was that in the East German phase, it suddenly became very tropical because you couldn't go abroad. These are some of my paintings. I used 3 motifs: the changing rooms against the forest, the healthy bodies, what was going on to the other bodies. I'm just showing you I'm moving quickly because it's a long talk, giving a sense of the feeling of the paint. I was looking at Cranach, who'd also painted the same forests. So whose bodies? The second motif I used was the big diving board. I threw paint and the way I was depicting it, transmuting it into what I hoped was a combination of both monument and lookout post. Just giving you a sense of the paint. The third motif I used in this project was the diving board. The diving board is what makes active the water, the absent bodies. I was also very interested in having a kind of conversation with some of the other more muscular artists who were working with some of these issues, for example, Anselm Kiefer, and incorporating ways of using parallel lines which echo the forms of railway tracks in a much less obvious way. And here's another one of those springboard paintings. And when put together, I also used, again, as in the other project, some family photographs next to contemporary works, next to archival materials. And that's just to give you a sense of it in exhibition, some of the works. And that's just a little bit here for those that are interested. There is an essay about this, which is available on the Contemporary British website, but it also talks about why would you paint these things? What does it do? What does painting mean here? The final series was actually the first, and it's in fact it's not in Germany. It was the last set of holiday photographs. I did this in the late 2000s. And I went to Bornholm, which is where my grandmother, my great uncle, and their boyfriends and girlfriends went on holiday. I sent, in advance of going, this time I did it a bit differently. So this is from the family to the social to a much broader context. I sent these photographs on all kinds of Bornholm holiday sites. No, nobody knew where they were. But what I did find was that there were several concrete installations which were built during the German occupation of Bornholm, largely in the dunes. These became the subject of my paintings. And they were kind of mixed in as what Ed Casey might call unresolved reminders, what Karen Till might call spectral traces. These remnants of the Third Reich become neglected and sit in close proximity to holiday homes. Now, we've got places, that's just a little bit of my studio at the time. Many of us have experienced the way in which revisiting places evokes memories of events that took there. For many, this extended to further seeming irrational expectation. We might even understand, empathize, or even perhaps remember events from the life of another by occupying the same space. We know that can't happen, but driven by this irrational desire, I went to Bornholm. Many places, of course, many resorts, most coasts are this mixture of pleasure and military significance. Bornholm was no exception. The series of works I made was this unused rocket launcher, and I thought concrete rocket launcher in the forest, which I thought about in terms of the ghost rockets that were seen flying above after post-war, which became a whole society fantasizing. They may or may not have been there. They might have been being let off in North Germany. Nobody knew. There's a lot in the dunes here. There's a lot to say about these, but I just want to give you a flavor of them because it's not going to be my last word here. I really want to give my mother the last word. She always had the last word, and I certainly don't want to deny her it tonight. The becoming and becoming English is very important. As Gilbert suggests, assimilation for exiled Jews in Britain was an ongoing negotiation rather than an attainable endpoint. As Lassner argues, such processes of becoming create an irredeemably unstable condition, and undoubtedly much of the literature that draws from this history reveals the painful and labyrinthine nature of this historical negotiations. You can have the last word.
Please, Anna asked, when will I stop being a refugee? When? Not immediately the war ended and she was not allowed to work in the post office delivering Christmas cards because her status was still enemy alien, nor the summer after when she was refused a visa for a holiday in France, nor when she was turned down for a job because the liftman who had lost an arm fighting the Germans might take offence at her German-sounding name. Though by that time Anna considered herself completely English. Perhaps when she got married and acquired an easy-to-say English name at the registry office, together with a little note informing her she would be fined £5 if she didn't immediately enter it on her ration book. Perhaps when the next wave of political refugees arrived from Hungary and refugee no longer meant the pre-war vintage. Yes, Anna had stopped being a refugee, but she had not come into a different past. The uprooting did not disappear, however old she grew. Here 2 dehumanized SS men hanged 2 young German soldiers. That was the plaque that had met her eyes near the S-Bahn Friedrichstrasse on her only return visit to her birthplace. Other people call their birthplace home.
Thank you.
And thank you very, very much, Judy. I'm very tempted, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot. I mean, you mentioned that your 2 sisters were in the audience. If they felt so compelled, of course, we'd love to hear from them, but I just leave it at that. We've had some interesting questions and comments coming up, so perhaps we should just start with those. Right, let me just, sorry, let me find them. Okay. Yes, sorry, is it Clarissa? Did your mother, obviously addressed to you, Judy, have a chance to comment on the resort series? I mean, did your mother, yes, interesting question, how did your mother react to what you were doing?
Well, yes, she did. And actually, she was both interested and proud, and not a little confused at the beginning. I think probably a lot of people in our situation have this, where she always writes and says, my children are English, my children are British. And then that was what she felt she'd given us, I suppose, in lots of ways. And then when I was very interested in thinking through other ways of being English, British, but in the end, she was really interested. And we were actually doing this at around the same time. We didn't talk about, she was writing her novels and I was doing this work. We didn't talk about it when we did it, but afterwards we did. Yeah, I've got some lovely photographs of her with the drawings too. So
I'm sure more could be said, but let's
yeah.
Absolutely. From Francisca Luagi in Leicester, many thanks for the talk. You indicated that you started viewing your work differently when you came in touch with the notion of post-memory. In the wake of this, did the theoretical angle or conceptualization of this change your work or practice moving forward?
Yeah, very much. I think I've tried to, I didn't really, this was not a talk about my work. I just wanted to show you a little bit of how the particular series that have been more inflected in an obvious way by what one might call the second generation issues. But it changed it very much because I was working with landscape and place using North Devon coasts as a starting point. I was thinking about what it might mean to always be separating and going to and fro, and how one might theorize that in relation to post-memory. But once that I'd become conscious, I felt absolutely essential that I started to make this work much more directly. And I did that for about 8 years. And then I felt that I had done what I could directly with that. My own work now, my current work though, is very much engaged still with politics on the edges of Britain, thinking about place in that kind of way, both energy politics, ecological politics, and other kinds of politics too. So it changed. Yeah, theory and practice are completely intertwined for me. And that's why I like it at Leeds as well.
What I've always been struck by, Judy, is that you do have this very, I think, actually quite rare ability to actually meld the two, so that the actual physicality of what you do is actually inseparable from the ideas. And that's.
Although I'm going to be a bit naughty, there's a little bit in which my mum wrote in 1967, where she's written about how the best artists don't really talk very much about their work. So it's in the article, but anyway.
Do you want to read it? Or
I can't, actually, it was too dark for me to see, because it's on this rather beautiful design page. I'll have a look while somebody's asking the question.
Fine. And I was going to ask you, I mean, two related questions. I mean, you mentioned, interestingly, I mean, there is a sort of this kind of tendency to separate the two phases of your mother's writing career, the kind of 1960s work, and then the more looking back, the sort of memoir, the two memoirs of her later years. And you said more than once that, you know, she wrote a great deal in between, as is entirely natural for any writer. I mean, are there any plans to publish or revisit some of that interim work?
Well, I mean, it's not that I know of, so it would be very nice.
Yeah.
I think, although I have to say I haven't read them, the novels. I've read the short stories and so on, but I haven't read the unpublished novels, so I couldn't say if it would be very nice or not, but it'd be great to have some more interest in that, see what it was. Yeah,
it's interesting that you haven't read them. Is there any sort of obvious reason for that?
I usually like to read her. I read her work when it was published. Didn't read it in progress.
Oh, so. Interesting. Okay. I mean, can you give us a sense of why that was?
I think because I don't, for the same reason that I don't necessarily like people to see. I mean, I'm showing you a bit in my studio tonight because I felt I teach all day with books behind me, and I thought it was a bit more fun to be in my studio. But I don't necessarily want people to see unfinished work that might need, in my opinion, revising. So it was really that as a sort of respect in that way. Also, if it was unfinished, I might have felt that I needed to comment on it, and she wouldn't have wanted that. So I think it's better.
Understood. Right, a question here from Diana. Sorry, I can't actually see the surname offhand. It's interesting that academic analysis of your mother's work has grown in recent years, and notably after her death. What do you think has prompted that? And then she says in parenthesis, I realise that literary analysis is not your field, so you may not know, but do you have a sense of...
Well, I do have a sense, actually. My mother, one of the things I didn't mention, which I meant to, so it's really good that I've had this opportunity, was in her late 70s, she suddenly started giving academic papers at Dorothy Richardson's conferences. She wasn't an academic, she was a creative thinker and writer. Because she'd been thinking about Dorothy Richardson for so long, when she found that there was this Dorothy Richardson Society, I think they, you know, and so there's some young scholars, younger scholars there who have found out about her and her work. Not all of, I don't know all of, I know a couple of them, so, well, I've found out about them, and there's one or two I've no idea who they are, so I don't know why they have, but yeah.
I have a question, or perhaps an observation. I was struck, you know, I've been following your work since the early 2000s,
yes,
as you well know, and I mean, this is a very personal reaction, but while, you know, obviously your relationship to those, particularly the pre-war photographs, poignant and interesting, and, you know, it's interesting to see what you do with them, but the work in the Resort series that I personally find more eloquent is what you actually describe as the images of absent bodies. It's the unpeopled landscapes. And I wondered if you might say anything perhaps about that dynamic that, you know, between the unpeopled and the human presence.
It's an anomaly for my work that those Strandkorb series have figures in them. They're the only work I've done probably in the last 30 years or 40 years that has evidence of, you know, is actually got a figure representation. All my paintings and drawings are empty. They're either in light, you can see traces of human activity. They're maybe enlivened when I'm in collaboration with Harriet Tarlow by voices from the place, through poetry, that you may see other things, but no, it's always like an empty space is really what I'm interested in. It was something about bodies that I felt I needed to address for reasons that are fairly obvious. And I wanted to not shy away from that, even though it wasn't really, in a way, where my strengths are, perhaps.
Now I'm looking at the clock, and if anybody has any other questions, I think now is the time to speak up. We have had at least 2 requests, Judy, for access to a bibliography to the various references that you gave. So I wonder if you'd like to send them to me, and then I could actually send out a group email to everybody attending.
Yeah.
Way to do it? Or...
In the do you mean, if they just mean the ones that, they're in the PowerPoint actually.
I could copy and paste them, couldn't I, and send them out, and I'll do that with great pleasure if you're happy for us to do that.
I should think everybody would be happy to have their work read more, so that's great, thank you.
Right, a comment here rather than a question from somebody watching from College Place, Washington State, USA. No questions, but just a profound respect and many thanks for the program. Thank you for sharing all of this and for all the preparation that clearly went into it. Right, yes, Rosalind again would like the bibliography. Clearly, okay, there's a demand. Lovely. Can I just pick up by way of conclusion on just 1 or 2 things? I was delighted and actually hadn't realised how much Griselda's Pollock's text about my very old friend. I don't know if you know that Lydia and I go back a very long way.
I didn't know that.
Absolutely. Lydia's a very fine painter, but you know, unlike, I don't think she's listening in today, but I shall certainly tell her, report back. But, you know, unlike you, she keeps any possible references to her parents' complex past very, very veiled, very, very unstated in a sense. But I would just like to add just a very practical point that Lydia and I were talking the other day, and she's agreed that she will talk not about her father. Now, Zygmunt, and this on International Women's Day, so appropriate. I mean, everybody's heard, everybody in academia, and sociology and beyond has heard of her very illustrious father, Zygmunt Bauman, but of course her mother, Janina, was a very fine writer and wrote 2 very, very poignant memoirs about her time in Warsaw Ghetto and beyond. And Lydia, to my delight, has actually agreed that in June, when I'm planning another intensive program of online events, Lydia will be talking about her mother, Janina.
Oh, so wonderful.
Really
wonderful.
Nice to be able to say. And perhaps just to round things off, finally, to say, well, first of all, that this has been recorded. As you probably know, we like to record all our events and then upload them in a few days' time to the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which is becoming, I think, a rich resource for all manner of interesting material. But also to say that, as Judith will know, one of the things I've wanted to do recently is to kind of pick up on this theme of kind of intergenerational kind of you know, interactivity and sort of, yeah, creative kind of tensions and dynamics. And we do have more in store. There are a few that have already happened. I won't go into those. They're on the YouTube channel. But I'd like to mention that actually next Monday, we're going to have a kind of a double bill, not really, but it's two different events, one after the other, one at 6 and one at 8. The first one's by Charlotte Grant, who's an esteemed academic in her own right, talking about her painter grandfather, Martin Bloch. So that should be great. And then secondly, a woman called Gilly Allenby, who you probably won't have heard of, and she has been doing an MA at Birkbeck, where I teach, and much to my delight, and I've been kind of very much kind of complicit in a way in encouraging her to research her own extraordinarily interesting, also grandfather, sometimes known as Johannes Ilmari Auerbach, or sometimes as John Ivar Allenby, and in a way that already says a lot. He was a sculptor who came to this country with a very fascinating and colourful life story. And then just looking forward into the further into the future, we've got on the 18th, again in association with the AJR, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's Anita Peleg talking about her Holocaust survivor sculptor mother, Naomi Blake. So that's something else to look forward to. And last but not least, somebody called Emma Blau, who herself is a photographer and involved in the kind of world of commercial agency, you know, sort of photography, talking about her, again, her grandfather, Tom Blau, on the 25th. So, you know, the dialogue, the kind of discussion continues. Very good. So last chance, yes, somebody called Clarissa Butler again, El Shan, wonderful and moving talk. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for organizing this talk and session. Lots of food for thought, which is the way things should be. So lovely. Many, many thanks, Judy. Thank you everybody for being here.
Thank
and I look
you.
forward to seeing you again. All the very best and good night.